So tonight's episode is a little bit heavier than usual, but this is in response to a reader question that we received on the question box that's linked down below in the description. And at first, I was kind of blown away, like, whoa, this is a serious situation. And really, when you're dealing with marriage, it is serious. But as Elisha and I were talking it out, we were seeing really all of our marriages have experienced some level of this, probably. Some level of hurt sexually, either in the past or the present, or we might experience that in the future. And so this is something that kind of impacts all of us, and it can be very dramatic, it can feel very dramatic, but God can really use it to unite couples and to just have his picture of marriage and forgiveness and unity displayed in a really beautiful way, that is in a way that the world is going to look at and be like, what on earth? Because it doesn't make sense. And so today we get to explore this listener's question, and hopefully it is encouraging to your marriage. It was encouraging for us to discuss, and we're praying for you guys, because this is a very real struggle in all of our marriages, whether it's to a little extent or a great extent. If you are encouraged by this podcast, if you would share it with someone you know, that is how it gets out to more people. We appreciate all of your ratings and reviews. They mean so much to us. And we're going to dive in.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Yeah, Katie, like you said, this prompted a conversation between you and I. And in reading this listener's question, and they really gave us a lot of context to the situation. And we probably won't read the whole thing, but just for context, this is a couple that's not been married a real long time. They've been married less than a couple of years, or I think around that time frame. And the listener that wrote in was the wife, and she was saying how she wasn't saved until she was in her later teens. And prior to her being saved, she, did some things that she regretted, in regards to partying, drugs, and alcohol, and sexual relationships with different people. And then she got saved, praise the Lord, and then met another Christian man. They've become married. And he didn't have a lot of the same type of experiences in his single years that she did regarding, he didn't have any other sexual partners. He didn't, he had, he married as a virgin, it sounds like. And then after the fact, now in marriage, those things are causing a ton of division, and he's really not, again, we hear it from her perspective, but it sounds like he's said some extremely hurtful and sinful things, and he's really holding now that past that she has against her, that past that she had, prior to being a Christian, which is pretty an unchristian thing to do. In any context, obviously. And so anyways, you and I talked about, and it's a pretty long question. We're not going to read all of the details, but I think that we've probably all heard stories along those lines, or maybe you've experienced living that story on some level where, you had shared your past with your fiance or the person you were dating, your girlfriend, and you felt like there was forgiveness, there was understanding. And then you get into marriage, and then they retroactively are going back and like holding that over you or lording that over you. And we've talked about this a little bit in past episodes, but I think it's a temptation in marriage, regardless of the extent of the sin. Obviously, the sexual sins of the past are always going to have a unique hurt and damage on a marriage relationship, right? Because that is an act that is reserved, for the marriage bed. And so I think there is something unique to that, but we've probably all experienced either that sin, holding that over, our spouse's head, or being tempted to, or feeling like your spouse is holding it over your head, or other sins. And so anyways, that's kind of the preface, more or less. I don't know if you want to add any more context before we jump into this.
Yeah, something that I appreciated when I was reading through it was that they have sought out godly counsel within their church, just for prayer and for understanding. And I think that's a really wise thing to do in this situation, is to bring someone else in to just be I don't know, a mediator
Yeah.
potentially. It sounds like a lot of blame. There's a lot of blame coming from the husband in terms of what he's deeming as his mental health, the thoughts he's now having, kind of swinging him into a depression.
Yeah, blaming that on her past sins.
Yeah,
right?
and really when I was listening to this or reading this, my heart really went out to the girl because you can't undo something that's been done, right? And you got married with it's over. It's done. Like there's nothing regardless of how sorry you feel for a sin of the past, you can't go back and erase that sin, right?
And it sounds like he went into marriage with pretty full knowledge of all these things too. At least that's how it was.
Or general knowledge, but he had knowledge.
Yeah, he had knowledge of these, which again, obviously, even if you come into the knowledge of something after marriage, obviously, I think it's incumbent upon you to forgive your spouse and to move on. But I do think that changes it even a bit. If these were things that were discussed, there was some level of disclosure prior to marriage, and yet he still sounds like he's kind of gone behind, after the fact.
Yeah, and so my heart really went out to her, and at first I was just very okay, this husband's really out of line. But then when I brought it into home and thought of our marriage, right? You don't know what you don't know when you're outside of an intimate relationship with someone. And so I think that this is something, I guess, to encourage the wife. I would say you aren't alone in having someone all of a sudden freak out a year and a half after the fact. Because the more intimate you become with someone, the more sin hurts. And so you have an understanding of things that you didn't have before. So the closer your husband becomes to you, the more jealous he becomes of you. And that's natural. Now it can be very unhealthy. It can be very sinful. It can be acted out in a sinful way, which sounds like is happening here. But that's a natural process for your spouse to get actually more jealous of you than your boyfriend was or your fiance was, or vice versa with your wife. And I think another thing is just coming from someone who was, a virgin or whatever you want to say, you don't have any clue how much sexual intimacy bonds you to someone until you've had it. And so that's something that going into marriage, I'd only kissed Elisha, and so as Elisha and I were taking more and more steps in our marriage towards that physical unity and that physical intimacy.
You mean leading up to marriage? Or are you talking
no,
about in marriage?
In marriage, things started bothering me more.
No. It didn't take that many steps, is what I'm saying.
There were different levels in our marriage where I was hurt for different things of the past.
Gotcha.
And all of a sudden, it really bothered me. It didn't bother me that Elisha had kissed another girl until I'd kissed him. And then even then it wasn't a big deal. It was oh, this is exciting. This is us. And then 6 months in, I'm kind of this kind of is driving me nuts that this happened with someone else. Because I know how I feel when I do this with you. And you felt these emotions with someone else, and it all of a sudden became very hurtful to me. And so there's things like that where you don't know what you don't know. You just think, oh, you've kissed someone else, no big deal. But then all of a sudden you do the act and you realize, oh, well, this is a really intimate thing. And you did this with someone else. So coming from your husband's perspective, I guess, I think there's a lot of spouses that get taken off guard where they think they're okay with stuff. They think they're chill, and they get hurt after the fact.
Yes. That's not negating that his response, again, we'll
go into his response.
Yeah.
I want, yeah.
Yeah. It was totally sinful, totally out of line.
Yeah.
And he should repent from it. And seek forgiveness with you. But you're just saying that heightened level of jealousy and emotion that he's experiencing probably shouldn't be a surprise. It's that's probably even kind of natural.
Well, I'm saying it might be a surprise, but I'm just saying don't feel like you're alone in that. And my husband is this total crazy person to all of a sudden start.
Sure, that whole they didn't care about this before marriage.
Yeah.
And now, because like you said, we've experienced that on smaller levels where you would wear something, right?
Yeah.
In dating or engagement. And I didn't, it's like, it's all good. And then, we experienced a deeper level of physical intimacy. And I'm kind of like, whoa, like, I feel that like, man, I really like love that you're mine, like that God has me for you. And there's a little bit of this jealousy that grows. And, and again, obviously, anyway, so
we had pretty tame physical relationships outside of our own marriage and our own relationship, but there were elements where I think we both were jealous of each other's past relationships more after being married. And that's common. So regardless of like whether you were intimate with someone before marriage or you weren't, physically or not, there was some kind of emotional intimate connection that you shared with someone.
Yes.
If you had other relationships. And so sometimes that hits later.
Right. Yeah. Where it's
Wednesday.
Exactly. The classic, like, no, we've seen that movie together. You're kind of like, no, remember, like, I did not see that with you. You're kind of like, okay, I think, what? All right, moving on. Like, think that was somebody else, and then you're like, what? And you have to like hash out that memory or whatever.
So there's that. But then going into the husband's response, because really that's the only thing that can change here. And it's like, if you are in, and we say the husband in this situation, but if you're in a situation where you're holding your spouse's past sins against them, do you want to stay married to this person or do you not? Because it sounds like the husband in this situation is feeling a lot of hurt. And so he wants the wife to feel as much hurt as what he's feeling. And so he's hurting her. And the problem in marriage is that you're just hurting yourself at this point.
Yeah, you're right.
Every time he's hurting her, he's killing the unity of their marriage.
Yeah, and they are bound together with two become one. And not only are you one, you are the responsible one. You're the responsible individual in that covenant relationship as the head, as the man. And so you're killing the relationship, you're bringing death into the relationship, and you're the one that's going to be held responsible for it. Even though, like you said, there's probably coming from a place of hurt and from who knows what happens, in a guy's head when he's trying to, process all of these things. But regardless, it's like you're bringing death into your own home by these responses, by, like you said, just having these vicious attacks towards her character that. And again, going to the past, she's been faithful since being in this relationship with him, right? This is, like I said, it seems like a disclosed past relationships, past, sinful activities that the conversations were had. They get into marriage as a Christian couple, entering marriage, like both. So it's like a Christian marriage. And then he's now bringing these up and just tearing her character apart. In inaccurate ways, really, because, it's not who she is any longer. And so anyways, I just, it's interesting how, again, I tell you what, I know the book of Hosea is often referenced, because of like that relationship, but the whole point in that was, and this isn't even the right context, right? Because she's been faithful in this marriage, in this context, but the whole point is it's like, no, who are we? Like, we are the unfaithful one. Like, the husband's the unfaithful. He's not been faithful to Christ. He's not been perfectly faithful to God. He's not been perfectly faithful to his bride, probably in his thought life, and in whatever he's looked at. And anytime you think you can lord or hold somebody's sin above them, you are in a very dangerous place of not grasping the gospel and of your need of a savior. And I do think that is a necessary component of saving faith, is seeing your need of the Christ's perfect work on your behalf, your sin. Like, and if you can't see it and all you see is somebody else's sin, it's really I really think you got to be questioning the authenticity of your faith or whether you're regenerate, because that is I feel like an undeniable characteristic of a truly regenerate, repentant believer, is this acknowledgement of your own sin, which then enables you to see the gift of God's grace for what it is, so undeserving, like so humbling, and you receive that. And only then can I feel like you actually extend grace and forgiveness. And so if you're not able to extend grace and forgiveness and truly forgive someone and move on, seeking wholeness, seeking a healthy relationship at that point, you really, I think, should be bringing into question your understanding of God's work on your behalf and your insufficiency, your own depravity and sinful. And that is the unfortunate thing. I'm not saying that some sins don't have more natural consequences on earth than others do, because clearly they do, right? Like your whole life of drunkenness and alcoholism is going to have, like your liver's going to have something to say about that, right? It's at some point in your life, probably there's going to be some natural ramifications, not to mention all the, crimes you might have committed when under the influence, right? And so on and so on, the people that you hurt in the midst of all those things. And so you can say, like, the guy that, slept with a bunch of ladies, like, well, really it's the same sin as the guy that just thought about sleeping with a bunch of ladies. And you're like, well, yeah, we're guilty. It's a sin against God, and it's a sin against your wife or your future wife. That's all true. But there are more physical ramifications to the physical act of doing it than there are to the mental act, right? Like both filthy sins. I'm not trying to say that like one's worse than the other. There's just more earthly, like practical ramifications to the one. And so with all that said, anytime we start categorizing sins and you start getting self-righteous, because, and she even kind of framed this way when she was messaging it, I think she said something along the lines of like, he didn't have as bad of a past or something like that, maybe it wasn't even that. But the fact is that without Christ, we really are filthy sinners. And that's, I feel like such a grounding, or what am I saying? Foundational element to the Christian faith for the man right now. Like, he needs to see how sinful, I don't know if he needs to see how sinful he is, but he needs to acknowledge his full deserving of God's wrath and of how his heart has been so adulterous towards God, probably towards his wife even. And yet God is gracious, right? His wife is gracious. And so this is humbling for me, even speaking about, because anytime I'm critical of other people, which is, unfortunately pretty consistent and pretty frequent, but when you're critical of your own spouse, I feel like one of the few things that brings quick healing or quick restitution is God and his grace and in his faithfulness revealing my inability to do anything right apart from his grace, and how much I've been forgiven and how much grace my wife has shown towards me. Anyways, I think of that in the context of anybody holding somebody's past against them. It's like, dude, if anybody started doing that with me, like, and I think that he needs to get to that place for himself. Like, if my wife started actually holding my past against me, like, and maybe on a scorecard, you can be like, well, you slept with more people, or you did harder drugs, or you committed, more devastating crimes, and you're trying to keep score that way, then you're not at all aware of the sinfulness of your heart. And maybe God's grace and maybe you were born into a Christian family, and that's God's grace probably that you were kept from some of those other sins, right? Some of those, what we would consider more, egregious or hardcore sins. It's like that probably actually wasn't your doing either. That was God's grace, bringing you into that Christian family. Anyways, I guess that's probably my prayer, knowing what I know, is that this husband would come to a true, and a more deeper understanding of his total inability to be right before God and before his wife, and that it's only by God's grace, and that would humble him. He'd be like, oh my goodness, look how much I've been forgiven. And I think once you do realize how much you've been forgiven, then you actually can forgive. And it doesn't sound like that's actually happened. Like, he actually hasn't forgiven her.
Yeah, and I think we could stop right there, because I think that that's the most important thing, is realizing, like, not taking the splinter out of someone else's eye and just obsessing about the splinter when you have the beam in your own eye. Mm-hmm. like that parable tells us in scripture. And I just think that, yeah, anytime we're just keeping track of score with sins, that's the ironic thing is in this marriage, her sins were prior to marriage and his are current. You know, they're present day, not loving, not cherishing, not tending his wife. He's the leader of their home right now, and he's tearing down their home. And, you know, the husband is the one who is like, yeah, the caretaker, the husbandry. He's the guy that's supposed to steward and build up this woman. And so I would just think into the future, you know, what is the outcome 5 years from now? You know, that your wife just regrets every last minute that she lived before she found Christ, to a point where it's crippling her and she walks around despondent and heavy and wearing this yoke that the Lord has freed her from. And when people see your wife, they just see someone who's burdened. Or would you rather her be vibrant and, you know, Christ filled and free from that sin that he freed her from?
It's insane that we're told to lay down our life for this is literally what husbands are told, is to lay down our life for our wife as Christ laid down his life for the church. And you're like, well, what was the state of the church when Christ laid his life down? Like, it was in a rebellious, state towards him. And his wife's not even there. Like, he's got a Christian, godly wife. That's what's insane about reading those passages in the context of like what the church was, you know, and how unfaithful the church was, or how unfaithful, you know, Israel was, going back to the book of Hosea. And you're like, well, that's definitely not the case with my wife. You know, like, that's definitely not the case in my experience here. And it doesn't sound like it's the case for him. And yet that's what we're told to do, is to lay our life down for our bride, as Christ did for the church. And the church was like this rebellious, still prone to wander.
Like a currently rebellious situation. And that's not what's happening here. But it's just, when you choose to hyper focus on the sin, you destroy your marriage. And there's nothing there but shame and hurt and pain. And if you're going to be married for the next 60 years, which is what the Lord would have for you, no wrong has been done in this marriage aside from what you're creating in this whirlpool effect of choosing to hyper focus on this sin that God's forgiven, and he's cast further than the east from the west. And I think of that in the same way, you know, if your husband has some sin, would you rather him walk around just like ashamed of his own shadow, tail tucked between his legs, not confident in raising his sons, not confident in speaking in the church, because you're just berating him and bringing up this sin over and over and over? Or would you rather have a husband that's confident, that's seeking the Lord, that knows what the Lord has done for him and freed him from, that knows that he's respected by his wife, that feels confident speaking into his son's life? Like, this is who God calls us to be as Christians. And when we aren't acting like Christians when we choose to dig up all this sin that the Lord's put to death. Voteberg Music Academy is different than other music lessons because the whole family can learn together. So instead of paying for each individual to learn music, which Elisha and I know from past experience can add up to thousands of dollars a month that our parents paid for private music lessons, families are able to learn by instrument. So we love seeing mothers and daughters and fathers and sons and siblings all learn guitar together or all learn piano together for less than $40 a month. So if that sounds like something that you are interested in, we have a coupon code listed in the description box to get you started for 10% off every month that you are a part of the Voteberg Music Academy community. So my mom gave me some advice when Elisha and I were engaged. And Elisha and I at this point had talked about our past, just sins in general, kind of big picture, sexually, maybe different experiences we'd had or different things we'd seen or different areas we'd fallen, stuff like that. And so we both knew generally where each other were at. And I was talking to my mom, and she was sharing with me her experience marrying my dad and different things that hit her harder than others or took her off guard. And she was just like, Katie, if Elisha ever comes to you with a sin and confesses sin, or you hear about, something becomes more clear that was a little vague at this point, and you were like, what? That happened? Then talk about it. It's obviously okay to be hurt. Let him know how you feel. But once that conversation's over and you've forgiven him, never bring it up again. And I think that was such wise advice. And I'm so grateful to live with a husband that has done that with me. My mom didn't talk to Elisha, but that's a principle that I really lived by in our marriage, because it's very tempting when you've been wronged to store it away as ammunition. And I think I'm going to bring that up next time and just prove what a martyr I've been, or just prove what a good wife I am, or, lord that sin over your spouse. And it can go both ways in marriage. It's a very tempting thing to do. And honestly, without that conversation that really stuck out to me, I totally would have done that, because it's a natural thing to bring up sins of the past. But that's not what Christ does with his bride. That's not what he does with us. And that's not what a healthy Christian marriage does. It doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be maybe multiple follow-up conversations and you really need to work something through that's very painful and very hurtful. But once that door has closed, you don't open it back up, because there's nothing to be gained at that point by opening it back up. You just let the wound heal, and you have to choose to forgive. Now, you don't totally forget a wrong that's happened in your marriage, but you don't ever bring it up again. And I just think that is something that was an incredible principle that is worth living by in a marriage, because there's just nothing to be gained by digging back up sins.
Yeah, wow. And boy, am I grateful for that, because
I'm not sure if I'm perfect in this
I
area. I don't know. I'm thinking
good.
back as I'm talking.
And I'm definitely the bigger, when it comes to that principle, that's blessed me probably more than you.
No, it's not like something I go around doing all the time.
It's blessed our marriage, and I think going back to even just kind of the shame that this husband is bringing upon himself, when you think of being the head of your home, you think of Christ being the head of the church, that what we are called to as men, but the glorious position that it also is, the honored that position is, and to totally trample that honor and that privilege underfoot because of your own, again, I'm not saying that hurt's not real. Hurt is a real thing, but then you see what Christ has done for you, and I think you truly can move beyond it. You truly can forgive. But instead, to choose the route of sin and to just dwell in it, and as you mentioned, you really do get to see the quality of a man by whether his wife is vibrant and thriving or not. And I'm not talking she's getting better and better looking, or she's making more and more money. I'm talking that spiritual vibrancy, right? That's in her character. It's in her aura that, is sometimes hard to necessarily articulate or identify why, but you see them blossom. And it's a blessing to see it, because I feel like I've seen that with my sisters, honestly, which is a huge blessing to see your sisters marry, and then to be like, man, I liked my brother-in-laws before they were married, but now after they're married and I see my sisters, I'm like, I really like my brother-in-laws because of how well my sisters seem to be doing. I get a little emotional sometimes, honestly, thinking about it. And that's what you want for your daughter, is it not? And so anyways, I say that all to say, what a true shame on this man, and a true shame on any man, a shame on me when I've torn you down so that you feel, I just want you to feel worse. And yeah, you hurt me, so now I'm going to make you feel this hurt tenfold, and I'm going to make you just wallow in it and just think what a shame on me, because again, like you said, I really think that is a natural sinful tendency of humans is to, yes, I forgive you, but boy, I'm going to save this. I'm going to think of a time where I need some ammo, and I'm just going to just rub this in, just rub it in your face. And again, that's definitely something that I've probably done, honestly, or certainly been tempted to. And it is so, again, it's damaging to the person, and it's damaging to the marriage, and it's damaging to yourself. And that's the crazy thing about sin, is it's all those things. It keeps killing the marriage. And it's going to take, at this point, again, I think the husband truly repenting and seeing what Christ has done for him and how undeserving he is. And then hopefully that, leads to actual forgiveness, and seeking restoration for the sin he's brought into the marriage as well. Like where he doesn't even just forgive her, he needs to now seek true forgiveness from her for tearing her down. Cause she talked about this. She's like, man, I get it. This is bad stuff that like is a part of my past, but like, I'm pretty sure, and she's not saying it like this, I'm paraphrasing, but
No,
like
she was really respectful.
Yeah, exactly.
Of her
Well-written,
husband the
respectful.
whole time.
And
very loving.
yeah, exactly. All those things. And but she's like, all things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. Like I feel like I was buried with Christ. Like we were baptized into his death. Now there's like the Bible makes it clear that like we are new creations in Christ, and the old man has passed away. Behold, all things have become new. The newness of life in Christ Jesus, and her being able to wrap that mind around that for herself, and then into her marriage, just like, well, that's definitely not how my husband sees me. It's definitely that's tough, right? That's really, really a tricky thing. Anyways.
Yeah, I think of that verse, sin brings death. And the thing is that there was sin, there was death, and then God redeemed that sin in this woman's life and saved her out of it. And now the sin that's bringing death in the marriage is the husband going and trying to harvest sin and dump it on his wife's head. That's the sin in this marriage at this point.
Dude, harvest sin. Isn't that crazy to think about? But that's what he's doing. Like, let's go back through. Let's see if we can get on some emails from 6 years ago, from before we were married, see what you said, or see what you did, and see if I can harvest some past sins here.
It brings death. And that's the thing, is anytime there's sin in your marriage, because that's the thing, is that there's going to be sin present day in marriages, right? In our marriage, there's going to be sin present day. And so allowing God to forgive that, allowing each other to forgive that and move on, is how we eradicate the sin. Is we let God take that sin, because he did. His blood's covered it. His righteousness has covered it. So why are we going to dig it up? And I think of just in this marriage too, there's an element of, we've talked about this before, but whatever your tapes in your mind are playing, whatever brain grooves your tracks are running to, then I'm saying this really weird, but like you can create these habitual patterns in your brain. And this is very difficult to do. So if there has been sexual sin in your marriage from either partner before or after, so say you have physical intimacy with your spouse, and your brain clicks over to that brain groove of, they've done this with someone else, or I know they've looked at this online, or do I look like whatever they've seen online, or is this interesting enough, or right? We can click into those grooves, whether it's been with a physical woman or something that they've seen or something that you've done, right? Maybe you've had interaction with a person, and your brain, when you're making love to your spouse, clicks into that groove, right, of somebody else. There's all these different unhealthy thought patterns that we can have. And that's why scripture tells us to take every thought captive. And it tells us to renew our minds, because we can do this on so many different levels. And that's what makes physical intimacy so beautiful, when it can be done with true unity and purity. And it can make it so painful and harmful, is because it's attached to all these other little things in life, or big things in life. And so this husband brought up, okay, I'm going into a depression, or I'm having suicidal thoughts, or all these things, and blaming it on the wife and her past. But the truth is that that's his own sin. That's not his wife's sin. That's him choosing to wallow in something that he can't control, that the Lord's told him to take captive. The Lord has redeemed his wife, and she's walking as a redeemed believer, and this man is not, and that he's choosing to wallow in this sin that he's not called to wallow in. He's not called to view his wife this way. He's supposed to view his wife as God views his wife.
Yeah, he's the one living in sin now,
yes,
like you said.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's very easy, though, for all of us, I feel like, and I mean, maybe I'm alone in this, but to hyper focus, fixate on our spouse's sin or just thought patterns that we shouldn't have that are unhelpful to our marriage. And you just have to click over and form a new thought pattern. Be like, I'm not going to let this be what defines our marriage.
Yeah, and it's crazy because I've so done that. It's crazy to think about, especially in the first probably 4-ish years of our marriage, how when I would get hurt or offended or whatever, my pride would get hurt. I would have my go-tos for, like, it was this brain groove, and it was just this, and they were things that were near and dear to your identity, to who you wanted to be. And I knew how to attack them and how to just...
Yeah, this doesn't have to just be sexual, obviously.
Right,
it could be anything.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. These weren't sexual things in our case here. Just things about your character that weren't true, but like I could frame it in a way where it's like...
Well, maybe they were.
And they were things, but they were things that... you really didn't desire them. It's not who you were aspiring to be. And anyways, the point is that I would instantly go there when feeling a little bit like my ego was on the line, or feeling a little bit disrespected, or feeling a little bit threatened in my whatever leadership role. And I'd go there just in this petty, again, sinful rut, these brain grooves, where I would just go to, and it truly had to be a rewiring of the brains, one, repenting from it and acknowledging who the actual sinner is in the situation, right? It's like, whoa. Yeah, but then you can like, whatever. I don't know if it's writing or hard. Is it code? What is it? I don't know if it's just like sketching, like getting a chisel in there and just carving out some new brain grooves. But it really can happen, like you said. And it can happen with physical intimacy. It can happen with anger and with pride. And yeah.
And really, every good marriage has done this, where they have overridden, because there has been sexual hurt in every single marriage that I know of, to some extent. I mean, that is not a isolated incident in some marriages. Like, spouses are going to be hurt. And so couples that have phenomenal, unified, free intimacy with each other have chosen to put that out of their marriage bed and be like, that's not us. That's not who we are. We get to have this freedom and this purity and this unity here. And it is not controlled by past abuse or past sexual partners or, sin that has happened in our marriage via pornography or even affairs that have happened after marriage. There's couples that have overridden those brain grooves where it'd be very easy to just kick into, I'm going to focus on the failure here. I'm going to focus, someone failed. And bringing up our spouse's failures is only going to damage the marriage. And so if you want to hobble along in your marriage, you can feel very justified in doing that.
Yes,
and martyred.
exactly.
And there is a sweetness that comes with the bitterness of carrying a bag of hurts towards your spouse. But that is not the kind of marriage that I want to have.
Yeah,
I think we're called to have.
You can go all the way through to divorce, feeling great about yourself and having a whole, enclave, like having this procession of support because you truly were the victim, right? You were wronged, you were sinned against, and you can just camp out on that to the total destruction of your home, to your marriage, to your home. And then what? Then what do you get? You get a torn apart marriage. You get to live a life now with total regret and carnage in your home and in your household. And the total, ruining of this covenant that God has ordained. It's like, or you can see something that's actually bigger than yourself, which is marriage. Marriage is bigger than the individual, and that's not grasped in Western culture, right? Like the individual happiness is the ultimate. Individual fulfillment is the ultimate in Western culture, and that's not the ultimate in God's design, right? It's two becoming one. It's being unified. It's becoming more than who you are as an individual in this covenant of marriage. And so when you see it as being far more valuable than your own feelings, than your own experiences, than your own fulfillment, but this thing, marriage, is actually way greater, way holier, way grander, then you're like, well, of course, some of these hurts, some of these sins I've had to forgive. Like, yeah, I'll do that for the greater good, for the thing that's actually greater. Like it's an actual greater thing.
And so like in this marriage, maybe you're in a marriage where you're like, well, I don't feel like my spouse understands how much this hurts me, right? So you keep cycling through these unhealthy cycles because you don't feel understood by them in this area. So you keep bringing it up. And I feel like that's a common thing with just negative patterns in marriage in general, or negative communication patterns, is you never quite get all the way down to the root of it. And so you just keep coming back to it over and over and over and over and really dragging it out. And so maybe this is a time to like sit down, have a courageous conversation about this, right? Or the way my parents have shortened that to a one-way conversation.
Yes.
And maybe this husband needs to respectfully, not tearing down his wife's character, but be able to fully communicate the pain and the hurt that he's felt. Instead of maybe just bringing it up in these random effects, maybe you just take time to talk through the whole thing. Is there anything else? Is there anything else? Is there anything else? Is there anything I'm doing present day that is, wigging you out, reminding you of the past? Is there anything else? Is there anything else? And then tears have been shed, forgiveness has been happened, close the door. Don't bring it up again. But get down to that point where maybe you're repeating back what your spouse has said enough to, it's like, okay, like I get this has hurt you, you know?
Yeah. What Katie was referencing is that there's a version of it online I think you can find called The Courageous Conversation. And then your parents have also
in Marriage Maximizer, they go through a variation of that they've,
it's called the one-way conversation. And boy, is this a helpful tool to like it's an actual framework. There's rules to how you have this conversation, and you play by it, and it is for things that you just it keeps coming up in your marriage. It's reoccurring. There's not clarity. There's not understanding. There's continual hurt. Okay, we have to have a courageous conversation around this topic. And so, yeah, again, I think that that's a great idea. I think that, and like you said, this can happen on either party, right? Because we hear a lot about, honestly, it's usually, you hear about it more common on the other side. It's more common where the wife's not forgiving the husband, right?
Yeah, that's usually it's not even a physical relationship. It's pornography. I mean, that's like the most popular sexual sin of our generation, right? Yeah. Because it's just so easily accessible today.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, and probably the most common, especially in the church.
Yeah.
And so it can be really healthy in that, and like in that context, and like you said, there is I'm just trying to put my finger on like that. At what point you're like, okay, I might not fully have understanding or grasp this, but then choosing to move on. Because I think that a lot of people can drag on conversations and hurts and past for their entire life because they're like, well, what about this? Well, I've been thinking, I still just don't have understanding.
I wouldn't. This is one conversation,
right?
And you need to move on.
Yeah,
I think
so too.
You've been married long enough. You've known this is happening. I'm like, maybe there's a few things you haven't gotten to or something that he just keeps trying to bring up. But this isn't like, it's one conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and like you said, maybe, who knows? Again, obviously, with the little information we have, we just see, a sinful husband and his response to his wife. But like you said, there could be some things that really, in the way that she's communicated about them or responded to some of his hurts, where he's not feeling at all like he's able to even articulate or help her understand why he's hurt, or like why it's a big deal to him. So there could be, sounds like I'm throwing him a bone. It's like, there you go.
Well,
like,
you just never know.
You actually do want there to be some understanding and
yeah, it's like anytime there's anything in marriage, it's two-sided to some extent. And maybe someone has a lot more on one side than the other, but it takes two to have a miscommunication or to have hurt. And I do think that there's an element of, we just don't know what anytime you hear from one side of one spouse, and this sounds like an incredible, loving, wonderful wife, honestly, who's been very patient with her husband processing in kind of immature ways, but we haven't heard from the husband. So you have to be like, okay, maybe he is something he would really like to communicate. And so I would just encourage him to communicate it and be very clear with his wife. And then let her, you have to choose to trust. And that is the thing in marriage. He's saying he doesn't trust her when she hasn't done anything in marriage. And this is, if you have sin in your marriage present day, you have to choose to trust until you're wronged again, or you have no intimacy. There's no emotional intimacy. If someone has asked for forgiveness and you've said that you've forgiven them, then that's your only option. If you go around distrusting all the time when they haven't given you reason to distrust, in terms of you've talked about the last incident, right? And put that to rest.
Sure.
This is something that you have to just go out on a limb with.
Yeah, maybe I could see there being like safeguards that you want to put in place.
Yes,
right?
You're right.
Like, hey, this is what I did. I was, on a work trip and I was whatever, I was alone. I was in my hotel room and I feel bad. It's kind of like, okay, like you can have full forgiveness and be like, hey, like, can you call me whatever at these times or whatever,
right. No.
like, I don't think that's wrong.
No.
Like,
I'm not saying safeguards or all those things are wrong, but I think there's an element of you have to choose to be vulnerable again.
Right.
With your spouse. If you always stay closed off, and I know that this is super painful for some marriages more than others, because there's habitual hurt that's happening. And I don't know how some couples walk through it, honestly. And that's not the story of our marriage. But choosing to be vulnerable again is really the only option towards oneness, if you want oneness. And I think that's why sin brings death, is because it puts up these walls between you and you can't have that total freedom like you did before. It takes time to have that comfort and that trust. But if you're choosing to distrust your spouse based on something that happened years ago, then how are they going to ever earn back your trust?
Yeah.
If you're just deciding that they're untrustworthy, right?
Yeah, that is crazy, honestly, because, when I think about everything you just said, I think it was so true. And when I've brought sin into our home, especially in regards to sexual content, or just sexual sins, there is an inevitable and I would say kind of inescapable temporary breaking of intimacy and of trust. Like that the sin does bring a real practical ramification. It's not just like, oh, I said the words and you forgive me, and it's just totally back to our happiest day of marriage, right? There is, even though you can truly forgive and you're like, I'm going to choose to trust you.
Yeah, there's like real wounds whenever
exactly.
a spouse hurts another spouse. So that's happened, with me and you going the other way.
Yeah, and the reason I was saying that's kind of crazy to think about is because I think it would be maybe easy for the guy to be like, hey, well, like, this is your sin that started all of this, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is, and that's the lie that maybe he could be telling himself is it's like, this is all on her. Like, she's the one that did all this, she brought this into marriage. And again, I think this is where, like, marriage is crazy when you actually look at what the institution is and what your role is as being, again, the federal husband, right? That federal head of your home. It's like you are marrying that person completely. And that's like the past is like whatever like you're marrying that, and you have to lean on Christ and his forgiveness, not just for you, but also for your spouse in that instance. And so anytime you're retroactively, I think, bringing up sins, it's a total degrading of the gospel, because it's like it's the antithesis of, like, this is not the gospel. This is the opposite of what Christ has done and is doing. And it's like one of the most unchristian things to do. It's like bringing up time and time again somebody's past sin that Christ has paid for, that he's atoned for. I mean, that is like at the heart of Christianity, is Christ's death on our behalf, right? Like anything that flows from Christian living and Christian morals and principles, like it derives from what Christ did for us. And so then to go retroactively and like try to undo that, be like, no, you got to pay for that again, or somebody's got to pay for that. Like, I'm going to make you pay for that again. Then you're not believing what Christ has done even for you. Like, if you can't believe it for your spouse, then you're clearly either not believing it for yourself or you don't see yourself as needing it, which probably is far more dangerous. And anyways, yeah, that's...
Yeah. And I think for things, I think there's a scapegoat here for certain sin issues in the husband's life, like oppressive thoughts. But you can't say to someone, this is your fault, why I'm having these thoughts, when they haven't done anything in the time that they've known you. It sounds like, to cause that. That is you letting your mind run and deciding to put that blame on somebody else when you're the only person to blame for these sinful thoughts, these sinful emotions, these sinful outbursts. I think this is a very common thing with the mental health phenomenon right now, is we want someone to blame for the sin in our minds. And that is, it's just wrong. And if someone's telling you that you're to blame for the sinful thoughts in their own head, I just don't feel that burden, I guess. Yeah.
And what's crazy is that, again, it's nuts. Just some things that came back to my memory of like some of my lowest moments, at least that's how I see it, of doing that, where me being the sinner, and using that and just classically making myself the victim, right? Like when we're hashing it out and putting it on you somehow. Boy, that's crazy. I'm sorry, because I've done that, and I can remember some. I'm sure you can remember them too. Some instances where it's like,
I was not thinking of
word, where I've used dramatic, crazy language to like demonstrate how, yeah, I get I'm wrong here, but let's flip the script real quick while we're at it, so that you feel far worse than I do. Like that you actually might even feel responsible for how sinful and irresponsible and selfish I've been. And boy, I'm sorry. That's not good at all. Like that is disgusting, honestly.
No,
and I think I'm so guilty of that. And I'm also so aware of it when you see it in culture. It is so pathetic. It is so pathetic when, I mean, I don't know whose YouTube, some people's YouTube feed, but seeing just like, like in marriage, somebody being unfaithful and then somehow wrapping it around so that it actually wasn't his sin. It actually wasn't his fault. None of it was actually his fault. It was somebody else's fault, and it's like, actually the wife is partly to blame for it too, because she didn't realize it wasn't his fault. Like you go to this whole thing and you're like, oh dude, I can't do this, Or
maybe it was his fault, but...
Yeah, but exactly.
And any time, or it was her fault, but they had a traumatic childhood, so this is how they're acting out.
Yeah.
Or, these different things where it's like, no, we're just responsible. Our spouse can't make us sin before God.
Every man sins when he is enticed and led away by his own lusts. Like the Bible makes it clear, and it falls on us. Our sins fall on us. And if you want to go back, you go back to Adam, bring in the original sin, and then you realize your inability to not sin, and only Christ and the new and perfect Adam can be the one that frees you from that sin. But you can't go back to 6 years ago, right? Or it's like, no, your sin today is your sin. It's on you. Anyways, yeah.
yeah. But I do think that's important, because we are in a culture that really elevates sin shifting, like blame shifting. And really it's sin shifting. And being like, well, I sinned, but really it's their fault that I sinned.
Yeah.
So I was wrong, but they were wrong first.
Yes. And this is why I'm so, I think, sensitive to it, because I just hear it in myself, and you feel the temptation to apologize, wait for like a couple of seconds and say, the reason I felt that, so there's my apology. Okay. I'll even let it simmer.
I'm so guilty of this.
No, I am way worse than you at this in our marriage. And and this is how bad I am. It's like when I actually apologize and just let it be, then I have pride. I'm like, dude, I think I just did it. I think I actually just apologized and let it truly be that. You'd be like, I'm sorry that I did that wrong thing. The end, And then, so it is such a human trait, right? It's such a common thing. And yet that's not what men of God do. It's not what men and women of God do. And also, this is another thing, just like on a more anecdotal, it's not what leaders do. Like leaders, it's bizarre. It is uncanny. Like when you see an effective leader bear the responsibility for something that was clearly not their fault, you're kind of like, whoa, like I want to follow that guy. Right. And on the flip side, when somebody you're kind of like, oh, they like kind of shared the blame there.
Yes,
like with somebody, it
like,
really
I'll
stands out.
Take it,
like,
but I'm going to spread it around.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
Well.
Exactly. I want everybody to get their fair share here. And so, yeah, anyways, we can wrap this thing up. Well,
we got kind of into lighter skies, and so it just got...
Yeah, we're like, this is actually fun now all of a sudden. But yeah, we do want to pray for this marriage and any,
we do.
Marriage in general, we want to pray for. We want to pray for our marriage. We hope that, we want prayer for our marriage. You just, when you hear these stories, you're like, man, your parents refer to, I think, is that you want to move from the vicious cycle to the delicious cycle. And yet the different vicious cycles almost seem impossible. Actually, I think they do seem impossible to get out of when you're in the midst of it. And it's so you don't want to lose hope, and I hope that this wife doesn't lose hope. I hope that, if in your marriage, whether you're the husband or the wife, and you just feel hopelessness, that you can have hope, that like, there is newness of life in Christ, and he can work in the heart of your spouse. And again, go, not to sound trite, but like, cause I don't think this is trite, honestly, is really praying, like praying for your spouse's heart to be, I guess, affected by God, and at some point we all probably come to the understanding of our inability to like change our spouse, right? Mm-hmm. Like we can't will our spouse to a right heart before God or a repentant heart. That's a work of the Lord. It really is him changing our hearts and bringing conviction of sin and bringing repentance. And then we want that we just want restoration for marriages, and anyways, for this marriage in particular. Yeah.
I do really want to encourage this marriage or just marriages in general that are seeking out counsel from people that know them in person, because obviously we can speak to something here on the podcast, but we have no context for this couple's life. We have no context with either of them, how they interact, any of these things in person, right? So we have to pull a million assumptions to be able to talk about this. And we're pulling from our experience, right? Which has nothing to do with their experience. And also just kind of like, okay, what sticks out to us when we do these podcasts? So I want you guys to know, obviously, we're making a lot of assumptions really anytime someone sends in a question and are just able to be like, okay, well, maybe this is going to be helpful to someone somewhere, even if it's not, this specific couple here in this situation, but someone who is going to have a lot more context and is going to see the nuances of how you interact with each other, or who might be overlooking something in their life because the other person's sin seems so glaring or whatever, is going to be your local body and your local church. So I would encourage you to go in person if your marriage is going through something like this, because marriage is really worth opening up about to other people if you need that support and that insight. And a lot of us do at different times in our life. And I would encourage you to go to a church, counseling facility or whatever before you just go to general counseling.
Oh, no doubt.
Like, don't go there. Go to a church, okay? Right. And like get people who, even if it's like Christian counseling online or something like that, I just really encourage you, like in person, if possible, is going to be the best with both of you there. Yeah, and you might not be able to find like formal counselors. Our church has an awesome marriage counseling ministry. They do.
But you might not be able to find that in your town or at your church. And so you really have to seek out a godly couple that you admire, that you look up to. Yeah, like my grandparents, my parents, I know Elisha's parents have done a lot of those unofficial, they aren't counselors, right? But they've done those unofficial mediations where they sit in a room with a couple and are able to give an outside perspective that's biblical and godly. Yeah. So just picking someone whose marriage you admire, that's ahead of you, and going and talking to them is great. I also... I just want to mention Marriage Maximizer because we have touched on this. I wasn't going to mention it, but if you are looking for, Elisha and I are young in our marriage. We've only been married for 8 years. We have a lot to go through still, and I'm excited about the journey, the highs and lows of that. But
But my parents did create a marriage resource that is a marriage course with us, just to share their information. And so if you don't have anyone locally, or you're just kind of like, we just need input in general in our marriage, I will put that down below, because I know that that's blessed a lot of our listeners. Yeah, but we'll just be praying for your marriages.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.